Well, this is the second year in a row that we have asked and had the pleasure of her accepting Juliet as our keynote speaker, and I think you can see why. She is really does an excellent presentation. Yes, we're ready for our next panel, which I happen to be on it. So Gabe and... Well, go ahead. So the next panel, which is called Using a Value-Based Enterprise as a Strategy, I am introducing my partner, Gabe Imperato, who will introduce our panel and moderate it. Thank you.
Do we have a clicker for them?
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone.
Do we have a clicker for
I'm a partner at Nelson Mullins, as Mike mentioned. Right downstairs in the floor below. You want this water?
I want the clicker.
You want the clicker? Okay. So Ed and Mike asked me to moderate this panel. They think I'm a good moderator. So I come to this issue from, my basic practice is in enforcement or responding to enforcement actions of the Stark Law and the kickback statute, and from the compliance perspective, as opposed to working in the trenches and developing value-based arrangements. Just as some background on this pathway, if you will, I recall years ago that hospital representatives who were desirous of entering into these types of arrangements with physicians realized that there were significant legal obstacles to that, both in the Stark Law and the anti-kickback statute, and started to lobby both Congress and CMS to essentially alleviate or relax those legal impediments to developing value-based arrangements. And a longtime friend of mine, Kim Brandt, who has been a leading administrator at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services through several administrations, actually took it upon herself to champion the development of what we refer to as the value-based exceptions to the Stark Law and the anti-kickback statute. CMS has had a basic antipathy to the Stark Law since its inception. You probably don't realize that while CMS has jurisdiction to bring enforcement actions under the Stark Law, they really never have. Enforcement actions under the Stark Law are a product of the whistleblower provision under the False Claims Act. So whistleblowers have really brought Stark case violations through the False Claims Act, which have involved significant liabilities, settlements, and penalties for healthcare providers. There's also an advisory opinion process for the Stark Law that CMS is supposed to administer, and I think if you looked up, you might find that they've done 2 advisory opinions in 35 years. There's also a self-referral disclosure program for Stark violations for organizations to bring those types of deficiencies to the attention of CMS and to negotiate a release from that liability to protect the organization. That system is kind of broken. I've made probably half a dozen self-disclosures through that process, and by the time they got around to accepting my disclosures, the statute of limitations had passed, so I told my clients to just authorize me to write a letter to CMS and say, never mind, we're withdrawing. So you can see that the relationship between CMS and the Stark Law and the kickback statute has been, a curious one. And then then we come to the development of these value-based exceptions to the Stark Law and the kickback statute, which essentially eliminate the compliance issues associated with these arrangements in an effort not only to clear the playing field, but to promote the development of value-based arrangements in the interest of, basically reducing and managing costs to federal healthcare programs and changing the incentives around for different arrangements between providers of healthcare goods and services. So our panel presentation here is we're going to try to get into, using these value-based opportunities and as a strategy for value-based enterprise. As I mentioned, I come from this issue from a compliance and enforcement perspective, but my partner here, Mike Segal and Ed White, have been busy trying to apply it in the real world. And we also have with us Jeff Thraman from Influence Healthcare. Why don't I let each of you say a little bit about your backgrounds that you bring to this? Mike, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I have been involved in the healthcare side of law for more years than I'd like to say, but I will say over 40. And a significant part of that business has been representing medical groups of varied types. I have represented and put together and organized and created and continue to represent several large single specialty medical practices, a couple of multi-specialties in Florida and outside of Florida. And I've also done a lot of work with clinically integrated networks, creating them and working with them, independent practice associations, and in the last decade or so, accountable care organizations where I have and still do have represented and still do represent many of them. So I feel I have a real feel for how physicians conduct their business side of healthcare and the good, bad, and the ugly of it. And that's where I come from.
Ed.
And I'm Ed White, and I'm also a healthcare transactional regulatory type lawyer. I've been doing this for almost 30 years. And I started out representing hospitals and consolidation with physician transactions in the 90s, and went on into helping providers create joint ventures and wrestling with the Stark Law and the anti-kickback implications of transactional work. And I've done a variety of stuff over the years. I've also done a lot with tax-exempt organizations, so we can overlay the tax-exempt concepts as we talk today. And would really say when these regulations were proposed, I saw some very revolutionary concepts in here that I think have the ability to really change the sort of the archaic ways we've all been structuring transactions with providers as we deal with this referral issue and the consequences under Stark and anti-kickback. So we see a lot of opportunities here, and we'll give you an explanation in a little bit.
Yeah, my name's Jeff Thraman. I come from the provider side of things, and particularly as a specialist. I'm a neurosurgeon that turned into a serial entrepreneur. Really the common theme around almost everything that I've done on the business side is really working with doctors and trying to have a bigger role in the healthcare space for the benefit of our patients. There's a lot of restrictions that are applied on us that come not only from the regulations, but also from the administrators who are trying to enact a lot of these things. So I look at these changes in the value-based enterprise rules as really a big opening, that for the first time, there's a lot of obstacles for doctors to get involved in healthcare that are falling by the wayside. And I've been in the space a long time. 30 years ago, I graduated from medical school, and I've seen managed care come about. I've seen various attempts with all kinds of different names on how to manage this, but the doctors have always been left out of the equation, and we just look at it from the trenches and we say, okay, whatever, just a bunch of more noise for us to deal with, and nothing changes. And this is the first thing that I'm seeing where there can be some meaningful change. And from a specialty perspective, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the primary care side, because I think actually the primary care docs have a lot harder time than we do as specialists. And the reason for that comes to a lot of what Juliet said about fee-for-service versus value-based care. For surgeons, we're not really doing a lot of extra services, right? If you come to me and you say you just had a seizure and your doctor referred you to me, and I do an MRI, and we're looking at a scan and there's a big tumor there, we're probably going to take the tumor out, right? There's not a lot of debate about what kind of services we're going to do. And we're either going to take it out surgically or we're going to take it out with radiosurgery. And that's going to be a decision we make together. And it's hard to regulate any changes to that, but there's a lot we can do as to what decision do you make. Is it going to be an open surgery or is it going to be radiosurgery? And that's where value-based care comes in. And it also has it's also tremendous opportunities on how you change the administrative side of it to free doctors up. And we'll be talking a lot about, what we're doing at Influence Healthcare and how these rules here that have changed in value-based enterprises have really opened the door for these new opportunities.
So, Ed, thanks to all of you. Ed, why don't you take us through sort of the concept as reflected in the stark exceptions in the anti-kickback safe harbors of a value-based enterprise and value-based arrangements.
Okay, thank you, Gabe. I'm going to talk a little bit from two charts in my PowerPoint. There's a lot more information in there, and you'll have access to the PowerPoints if you want to see more of the details. But the starting point is there's new developments that have occurred under the Stark Law and the anti-kickback statute. The Centers for Medicare Services, which administers the Stark Law, and the Office of Inspector General, the OIG, which administers the anti-kickback statute. The first time in my career that I can remember, they worked together in tandem to create these regulations that could work together. And that was one of the criticisms of the past. You had these separate regulatory bodies, and it was hard to fit transactions within the schemes or designs of both. But they've worked together and they've coordinated, and we have new Stark exceptions and we have new anti-kickback statute safe harbors. And these exceptions and safe harbors are designed to protect compensation relationships. And the emphasis of the rules is to help providers transition from fee-for-service to these value-based payment mechanisms. And in this chart, I just want to give you a quick overview because we'll talk a little bit about this from time to time. But if you look at the center of the chart, that's the value-based enterprise, and we're depicting that. And when we talk about a value-based enterprise, this is terminology out of these regulations. It's a concept out of the regulations, and what we're saying is you should consider using this concept as a strategy in your business. And I think Jeff will talk about that more in what he's doing. But it can be a vehicle to align providers. You can leverage the value proposition of the providers to create the best returns with the payers. And it's basically an intermediate entity that you can use to contract with payers and providers. And much like the ACO REACH program that you heard Juliet talking about, this is kind of the concept. I mean, the ACO REACH program, Medicare pays a capitated payment to an entity called an ACO REACH, and it contracts downstream risk with providers. And it is aiming to make a margin and a profit off of its ability to effectively select providers and monitor providers to make sure they're moving down these pathways to create these outcomes. And so in this chart, what I'm depicting, this is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of ideas. The entity on the top, the box for the healthcare provider, is just to depict the party that's setting this thing up. And it can literally be anybody. It might be a provider, it might be an entrepreneur, it may have investors on the left side if you need capital infusion. On the right side, I've got the payers. I mean, the ultimate aim is for the value-based enterprise to be contracting on behalf of providers. It can be commercial payers, self-funded plans, ACOs, Medicare Advantage plans, et cetera. And below the value-based enterprise depicted on this chart are all the different type networks or provider groups that can be combined to align to work towards these goals that the value-based enterprise has put in place. And they would essentially be plugged into the benefit of these new rules that are going to come from this value-based enterprise concept through participation agreements or contracts, much like an ACO has, defining what they're going to be doing and how they're going to be working And the value-based enterprise itself is there to monitor and assess and make sure they're moving down these pathways. Now, a high-level summary of these rules, I like to refer to them as creating three models. That's not the nomenclature in the regulations, but they really kind of work in three models. And the first I refer to as care coordination. That would be an introductory model, sort of a beginning model. There's no payer involved necessarily, and there's no risk being assumed. It's just bringing providers together to work on care coordination concepts. The second model would be a partial risk. And again, both CMS and anti-kickback, they have similar rules that work in tandem. They're a little bit different. The partial risk is what I refer to as sort of an intermediate model. And for the Stark Law, that can be as little as providers are at risk for 10% of their compensation. That can be through withholders or failure to achieve certain benchmarks or metrics, not unlike what's being done in paper for performance contracts today. For the anti-kickback statute, safe harbors, the providers have to be at risk for a minimum of 5% upside and downside risk. And the value-based enterprise itself has to have different levels of risk based on the type of contracts that are being utilized. The third model I refer to as a full risk model. I guess you could call that an expert model, but that's capitation and global payments. And one takeaway point of these rules is the benefits we're going to talk about in a minute. You get them under both the partial risk or full risk, and you never have to migrate completely to full risk, and you may never go at full risk. I mean, if you go as far as care coordination to partial risk, you can avail yourself of the advantage of these new rules. Now, they only apply to the revenues that are coming through the value-based enterprise and the activities that are being conducted through the value-based enterprise. And so you still may have pockets of fee-for-service out there, but to the extent you're aligning along this, you're moving into these new rules. I like to refer to the value-based enterprise as a hub. It's the centerpiece. You have to have two or more participants. You can create a value-based enterprise by contract, or you can set up a legal entity. If you're going to use this as a strategy, as we're suggesting, then it ought to be a separate legal entity, have its own governing board. It's responsible for overseeing the administration of the protocols and corrective action if providers aren't doing the work. But you can do this in a contract. If you have a simple value-based enterprise between a hospital and physician practice or two practices or some other provider, you can do that. You have to have at least one value-based purpose. And then there's four that are allowed: care coordination, improving quality, reducing cost, or helping the providers transition from fee-for-service to value-based payment mechanisms. You have to have at least one value-based activity, and really there's nothing defined here. The value-based enterprise gets to create its own protocols, its own processes, the measurements, and whether or not they're achieving the value-based purposes. It basically can act as its own innovation center. And one of the new rules under Stark is when you're in the care coordination model, physicians can actually be paid for making referrals. I mean, that's just unheard of under the classic Stark regulations that we have now. You have to have a defined target patient population. There's no attribution like in the ACO world. You get to define the target patients you're aiming your services at. You need to do that in writing. You need to have a governing body that monitors and adjusts care coordination. And it's really something, there's different levels of requirements of specificity that the care coordination requires the most monitoring and adjustments. But that's really a good best practice to do throughout the whole term of the value-based enterprise, wherever you're moving. And we'll talk in a later session about using the value-based enterprise as a general safe harbor or safe haven for your activities. I'm going to quickly move to another chart. I'll make this very quick, but this is what we refer to as an evolutionary depiction of the creation of a value-based enterprise. And again, we're focused on a provider-driven value-based enterprise. It's the only reason we have a facility there in the top box. But in step one, you have a facility. It's created a value-based enterprise. Let's assume that's a limited liability company. And they're now working with a group to create, and you can put all the traditional stuff that people are trying to do now under the old rules, care coordination activities, gain sharing, co-management, clinical integration. You can readily put all that. This can envelop those kind of activities right now. And you only need 2 participants. So here you want to grow something like this, but we're showing this in a very basic elementary step. And the point we tell people is take this one step at a time. You don't have to dive in and be doing everything all at once. So this is a very simplistic model. We have 2 participants. We create a value-based enterprise. Step 2, we're in a care coordination model. There's no payer involved. There's no revenue stream coming from a payer. So the creator of the value-based enterprise, which here is a facility, is putting the money into the value-based enterprise for the initial efforts, where capital is needed. Now, they've got the group working on value-based services. They're paying them some incentives. And then eventually it wants to migrate to step 3, where it is negotiating with payers for value-based contracts on behalf of the providers. And we've now labeled it a risk-bearing organization. That's not a requirement. It doesn't have to evolve to that. But if you're entrepreneurial, that's an opportunity to make money. Just like the ACO REACH program, the difference between what you're contracting with the payers and what you're downstream contracting with the providers is an opportunity to make margins if you want to bring in investors, et cetera. So that's just sort of a high-level view of how to sort of evolve a value-based enterprise. The key advantages when we talk about using this concept as a business strategy, the key advantages are reducing compliance risk. Under the Stark regulations, there's no fair market value requirement for compensation paid to providers. There's no prohibition on the volume of value compensation varying with the volume of value referrals. And if you have these groups or in group practices within the Stark definition, the physicians can be paid compensation in direct proportion to the volume of value referrals they make of designated health services, which is just deadly under the classic Stark regulations. But the concept is if you're in risk-based contracting, you're going to be trying to control the volume. You're going to have natural tendencies to control the volume. The anti-kickback statute safe harbor is a little bit different. When you're in care coordination, it still has a fair market value requirement if you're using cash compensation, and it still has a prohibition on the volume of value payment referrals. And that dichotomy between Stark and anti-kickback we'll talk about later in the compliance session, but it has some very meaningful insights there. But the anti-kickback statute, care coordination safe harbor does allow you to pay in-kind contribution to get the value to the providers that are coming together under the care coordination concepts. And you can disproportionately subsidize, a value-based enterprise can disproportionately subsidize the providers up to 85% of the cost. So if you're going to fit within that safe harbor, the providers have to pay only 15%. That could be technology, that could be caseworkers, that could be whatever the capital cost needed to do those care coordination activities and bring those providers together can be done disproportionately. That is a departure from the classic rules on the anti-kickback statute. As lawyers, we're always looking at everything being proportionate in joint ventures or fair market value in transactions. They've clearly migrated away from that. And that leads to the second point. You can use the value-based enterprise if you've got investors and disproportionately the capital cost to stand up the enterprise and get the technology and the infrastructure and the processes going. You can restrict referrals. So all these providers that are now plugged in through participation agreements, primary care, specialists, you got surgery centers, hospitals, imaging centers, et cetera, they can all be part of this network that are working on common value-based initiatives, and you can put in the obligation to refer first to those other providers. And there's 2 exceptions: patient choice, or the patient's needs could be met better somewhere else. This overlaps this concept of monitoring and assessing protocols and making adjustments and taking corrective action. It's required under the care coordination and to a degree on the other models. Overlaps very nicely with clinical integration standards, so you can actually be building clinical integration at the same time you're meeting these exceptions under Stark and protections under any kickback statute. And you have independent providers jointly contracting with payers, and you can build in those protections simultaneously. You can also use the value-based enterprise, we're going to talk more about this in the compliance section, as a standalone safe harbor, whether you're in specific safe harbors. And Gabe likes to refer to it as generally as a safe haven. If you're doing this meticulously and you're doing this in good faith, there's a lot of advantages there. And you, like I said before, your ultimate goal is to leverage your value proposition with payers for the best returns. And if you have the entrepreneurial desire, you can actually go for making a profit as well and turn it into a profit center. That's a high-level overview.
Just one comment. I think from the government's perspective, the key to this regime is that they flip the incentives. So the incentives are for quality, coordination, and cost control, not inducing referrals that can lead to overutilization. And so that kind of strips out the main concern that the government has with arrangements between providers, which is why there's no fair market value requirement or no concern about volume or value.
And what both agencies have said in the preambles to their regulations, and they've both said this, that when you're in risk-based contracting, and risk-based contracting can be that partial risk, when you're in a sufficient amount of risk, they don't tell you exactly what sufficient is, but when you're in a sufficient amount of partial risk, they both said there are more natural inherent limitations on overutilization, encouraging physicians to overutilize, which Stark is aimed at, or preventing remuneration being paid for referrals. And so what they're saying, back to your point, is you're in a place they want you to be that can do more to protect against those two harms the government is seeking to protect, its payment stream from, than anything they can regulate. And so that starts the proposition.
Well, actually, it puts pressure on the prohibition against the limitation of services more than anything else.
Yeah, so. And that's another issue you have to be monitoring and delving with, because you can't deny service.
We'll get into more of that later this afternoon. Mike, obviously, physician participation in value-based enterprises is kind of pretty important. I know for as many years as we've been practicing that this is kind of your space, both in terms of representing medical groups, independent practice associations, ACOs, clinically integrated networks. Give us some pearls of wisdom concerning prospects of business potential for aggregating physicians, herding the cats, if you will.
Happy to do it, Gabe, but I want to mention that the chart that Ed's providing, which I remember when he created those, which was during COVID. We didn't have much to do, so we were around home all the time. And it's funny, Ed and I never even knew each other until 2018 when our two firms merged. We didn't even know each other then, but we've gotten to the point, because we've been pushing this value-based care area so much, that I don't think a day goes by when we don't talk to each other at least once or twice. It's just we've become tied at the hip, and it's been a very, very enjoyable relationship for me, and I'm happy we're able to work together. And Gabe, I recruited him to the firm.
This is true.
1992.
Fortunately or unfortunately.
Yeah, 31 years we've been working together. So two very close people to me. Yes, I have done a lot of work in the physician space over many, many years, decades. And it's almost entirely been, until recently, for fee-for-service medicine. And in fact, the big groups that we put together starting in the 1990s were created primarily, usually single specialty practices, and created primarily, not entirely, but primarily to be able to legally negotiate managed care contracts and put together a whole bunch of people as a group and then go out and try to get the best rates you can. And if you have a large enough amount without actually violating the antitrust laws, you can have some leverage, and negotiations are always about leverage, to be able to get the best rates possible. And that worked in varying degrees for a very long time. It's never easy to put together a large group of doctors, I can tell you that, even if you have these great ideas in mind, because they're people. And I've said for a long time, I'm known as a cat herder because I'm herding cats being the physicians. And it's very hard to herd cats, but we do it. But, and the same thing when we were putting together even IPAs and CINs, always pretty tough to put them together to do fee-for-service contracts because of antitrust laws. But we would put together for other reasons. I tried to use a messenger model. They said, you can do it if you use what they call a messenger model. I tried that twice, and both times to no success, because it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I always thought that was like an elusive concept that didn't work in reality.
But really starting, I think I can find some speeches that I gave in 2009, I think. It goes back as far as 2009. I had PowerPoints, and I started talking about how we were moving from fee-for-service towards something different. I don't know if we called it value-based care at that point. And I was quoting Bob Dylan, "The times they're a-changing." And, well, they're still changing. And, so this has been going on for quite a while. But we were faced with a very, very difficult problem, which was that if you create a medical group practice and you have Stark, and you have anti-kickback, which was essentially saying that you could not refer for medical services and in a lot of different spaces, and basically you couldn't pay for it under anti-kickback for referrals. It made it very, very hard to really create something that was modeled around reducing quality of care. How are you going to do it? So you'd always run into the wall. And there was a lot of complaining about it to CMS, and ultimately the result were these regulations, which, by the way, I want to tell you have now been out, if you count, almost 3 years. They were released in December 2020, and although I think that most of the healthcare world now knows they exist and have a pretty good idea of what they are, I don't think that the vast majority of the healthcare world has yet determined how to use them properly or want to use them properly. Part of what was being talked about by Juliet will be talked about by others. We're just at the cusp of seeing these things really come in, be used in a meaningful way. And one of the people who I think is going to be using and is using them in a meaningful way is Jeff, and it'll be interesting to see when he talks about it. But once they had these rules, they put them together, the new regs, then all of a sudden there are things you can do to lower costs and produce better quality of care, such as Ed has been saying, because now you can incentivize people. I just saw a OIG opinion that came out, I think, in the last couple of weeks. Not directly this, but pretty close, because it was done in an employment setting, but it sets a standard. And essentially, they okayed a request to be able to pay the physicians in the group to do surgeries on an outpatient basis at certain centers that push to lower costs. And so they allowed bonus payments and said that was okay. It's only a stretch from there to say you could do it even outside the employment arena in a CIN, for example. And I think that it's just in that, we have Medicare saying that they want everybody in some sort of value-based care arrangement by 2030, and they seem to be serious about it. They've been saying that since 2021. So this is rolling down the pike, no doubt about it. It may not be rolling super fast. It's kind of like, you're in the soapbox derby, and you get your soapbox ready to go, and you go down the beginning of the hill, and it starts going down a little, and then eventually it just starts coasting. Then you're going really fast. I think that's what's going to happen here.
So Dr. Thraman, you're an entrepreneur, physician, and as Mike said, maybe the target year is 2030. Sounds like electronic vehicles by 2030. I don't know, where are we with this? What are you seeing out there in the market, and where do you think we're going with this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's an exciting time. I don't really get into I never get into the concept of saying something's going to happen by such and such a date. I think it's just, it doesn't make any sense if you're actually an operator and you're doing things, because you don't know what you don't know, and it's impossible to say where you're going. And I would say that, looking at the rule changes that came about here, I think the big opportunity is that you really get to work with doctors to change how healthcare can be delivered. And that's the number one thing. And I think you do have to make a big separation between primary care and specialists, because it's really just not that complex on the specialist side. It's not going to come on the specialty side, I don't think, from a vast change in the amount of services that are delivered. For instance, if you have a brain tumor, it's going to get treated, right? You're not going to debate the process to do that. But there's a lot of decisions that get made along the process as to how you treat that brain tumor and how you do it in the most cost-effective way that just have not been available before, because you could not sit down with the doctors and say, hey, if you guys change this, you can save all this money and the patient is actually going to do better. What do you say we do that? And the answer you get is, listen, I'm backed up an hour and a half in clinic. I got 3 traumas in the trauma room. I can't deal with this. And they're out the door and they can't change their practice. There has to be a reason. There has to be something that they can do to change. And I think the big risk of value-based care, and the big thing you're seeing on the primary side, which honestly I don't like, it's the purchase of the primary care physicians. It's this loss of autonomy by those physicians. You're starting to see it on the specialist side with private equity coming in and rolling up groups. You see Optum Health out there buying surgical practices. So you see the autonomy of the physician going down. And that's my number one concern. But I think these changes, when you start looking at this as a strategy, what's the strategy? I think the first strategy is you partner with the doctors, you show them a way that they can maintain their own autonomy and they can go forward. And the thesis would influence healthcare is really this. It's that you can't fix the healthcare system. I mean, that's how I look at it. I look at the current healthcare system that we have as something where you have, let's say, 60 years of well-intentioned, and I'm going to emphasize that, well-intentioned, but really ill-informed administrators and politicians changing the system, coming up with rules, trying to make a name for themselves with this law being passed or that law being passed. And you wind up with this super convoluted system that is very difficult to understand. And it came with really no input from the doctors at all. And if you take this over to the specialty side, there's a lot of opportunity to change that. And so our thesis is really, healthcare is as simple as a physician or a patient walking into a physician's exam room, sitting down, talking about what the problem is, and then coming up with a plan, right? I mean, that's like the common sense thing. That's what everybody does when they have a problem, and you're sitting in front of the doctor, and then the doctor makes, hopefully, what's the best decision for you. But a lot of times, the doctor isn't allowed to be involved in a lot of the things that will make that cost of care better, or they're not paying attention to it because they have all these other things that they have to do. I'll just give you a very simple example. There's one operation we do within neurosurgery, and all spine surgeons do this. It's a simple thing. If you have a problem with your neck, and let's say you have pain or pinched nerve or stenosis of your cord, We go in and do a very simple operation. It takes about 45 minutes. Make a little incision in the skin. You stick your finger in there. You sweep the carotid over, and you're looking at the front of the spine, and you just take out the disc, and you fuse it together, and you're out. It's 45 minutes. Now, you would think that to get reimbursed for that, all you would have to do is basically say, dictate that you did that one particular procedure. But that's not what happens. We have about 12 different codes that we have to put together to send that bill in. We have to send our op report in there, and the op report doesn't correlate to the codes at all. And then somebody who just graduated from high school and took a coding course is sitting there reading my op report and trying to match all of those codes up. They come back to my office and they say, you can't get reimbursed because nothing matches here. And then your team is doing all of this education of that coder, trying to get this approved. It still gets rejected. And then eventually, 6 months down the road, you get paid. What is the cost of that, right? I'm going to maybe get paid $2,500 for that case. I mean, I just spent $2,500 in admin fees doing that. So there's about $1 billion or $1 trillion of this $4 trillion out there that's basically fraud and administrative nonsense. And if you can partner with doctors, you can get away from that. So that's what we're doing with Influence Healthcare. We're going to the doctors, to the surgeons in particular, and we're going to start with spine surgery because it's one that's very convoluted because the example I just gave is a spine surgery example. And we can go to the surgeons and we can say, what are the things you can do to save costs here? We're not even going to talk about improving quality because almost all surgeons, you're not going to go into a surgery and be like, hey, I'm going to do a half-assed job here, right? Unless somebody pays me more money. I mean, it just doesn't happen other than, some outliers that you have in every profession. And unfortunately, some of those, movies get made out of them and that sort of thing. But you're really not going to have that. But it's what decisions can you make? Simple decisions. They're going to save a lot of money. I mean, one perfect example is, I'm going to do this case in an ambulatory surgical center, not in the tertiary care hospital. I'm going to use this generic spine implant over here. I mean, for God's sakes, it's a plate. It's a plate with 4 screws for this particular procedure I'm talking about. How much innovation is there going to be in a plate and 4 screws? I can tell you the answer is zero. It's zero. It doesn't matter what plate you use. But if I use this plate from vendor X, maybe the hospital's paying $1,200. If I use this plate over here, or I use a plate that's vertically integrated and it costs me $25 to make, and you put that into the system, huge savings across all the different implants. You can have surgeons participate in specialty hospitals as opposed to the tertiary hospitals. Imaging centers, how much imaging do you do? All of these things, if you vertically integrate these, and this is what Influence Healthcare is proposing, if you vertically integrate all of these and you bid them into the cost of the bundle at cost, the profit margin across all of these things goes away, and now you're delivering the same quality care. You're just doing it at a fraction of the cost. And the surgeons are making more money by making these decisions, by paying attention. Because now when that guy is so busy and I'm saying, hey, what about this implant? Or why not move your case over here to the ASC? I say, and you're going to make a lot more money. Now they step back and they say, okay, my kid's play can wait. What are we talking about here? How can we make this work? Right? So you give them an incentive and a reason. It should have been the way it's been the whole time, but until these changes came about, you simply could not have that conversation legally with the physicians. And now you can. And I think this presents an opportunity where the private practice model can be preserved. The autonomy of the physicians can be preserved, and you can start partnering with the surgeons to develop the new cases that are done, and you can come up with very simple ways to get those reimbursed. Basically, I do an ACDF, I dictate I did an ACDF, everything went fine. Boom, I get paid. Done. So that's really where we're trying to go with this. We're focusing on cutting the fat out of the system first, and then moving on from there.
So they're passing me questions to ask you here.
What's that?
They're passing me questions to ask you.
Yeah.
So you started out in business early on before this all developed. You had some issues originally starting out. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, great point. I mean, this is near and dear to my heart because, you know, I went to medical school at Cornell. I went out to the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix. If people aren't familiar with it, it's the busiest neurosurgical center in the country. We do 50% of our cases come from outside the United States, super complex stuff. It's an honor to get into that program. So I went there, took a training spot, and then went out and started my own practice up in Boulder, Colorado. I didn't want to work for anybody, always been an entrepreneur. Started actually a company when it was a hospitalist company in Arizona when I was a resident. But went up to Boulder, started my practice. There were 3 guys in town. They all left right after I got there. I was trained in the modern techniques. They really weren't. The hospital put a lot of money into bringing me up there. I didn't work for them, but I told them I needed about $10 million in new equipment to be able to do modern neurosurgery. They went out and purchased all of that. So I come up there, and then I wound up building the largest practice in the northern part of the state, and we were doing all kinds of crazy, complex cases. And then I came up with an idea, along with some other engineers. We developed this new idea on how to fuse the spine together in a more minimally invasive fashion, and created a new category of spinal fusion that was very minimally invasive, cost-effective. So we start building this up and going out there with a spinal implant company. Goldman Sachs was one of our initial investors. They came in with a fund and they said, hey, listen, we can't put money into this unless you either get out of neurosurgery or give away your shares. So, and this was all related to Stark and anti-kickback. And I said, well, I won't use my own innovation, right? I won't use it. I'll do it the old way. And they said, no, you can influence other people to do that. You need to get out. So I gave my practice to my partners. I went the business route. And we eventually built it into a large medical device company, and I sold it to a public company called Biomet. It's now Zimmer Biomet, big orthopedic company out there. I did the same thing with another company called US Radiosurgery. This was a CyberKnife type company. It was a new surgical tool that was out there that could treat tumors through radiosurgery instead of open procedures. Huge cost savings and great outcomes. We were the 4th center to get one. I got an exclusive in the state of Colorado for 3 years. And then I wound up raising some venture capital dollars. And we went out and put about 20 of these centers in throughout the country. And we were building these up, and they were all partnerships with doctors. Then there was a change in the Stark law where they changed the definition of an entity. We couldn't do it anymore. We had to dissolve it. We wound up selling it actually to another public company to get out from that so that doctors didn't have anything to do with it. I had one other company. It was a neuromonitoring company where I was having all kinds of problems in the OR with quality. And neuromonitoring is when you're doing these complex neurosurgical procedures, a lot of times you're compromising the blood flow to the spinal cord or the nerves, you're putting retractors and you're pushing things around. So what we do is we send people in before the surgery, we stick little electrodes, needles, in throughout the body, and that's being monitored by a technician, and it goes remotely to a cloud where there's a neurologist looking at any changes. And if you're putting too much pressure on something or blood flow is causing a problem, somebody calls into the room and says, hey, doc, you got to release that retractor or you're going to lose, the right leg. So you release the retractor and you do this sort of thing. So you're getting all this intel to help you, but you're really counting on the training of those techs. And a lot of the for-profit companies at the time, there was a lot of money to be made here, and they were just taking techs and putting them in there. And I could tell when they didn't know what they were doing, and I would just sometimes stimulate something, and I would hold it up in the air and just say, hey, what are you seeing? And instead of them saying, I'm not seeing anything, they'll be like, oh, I'm getting a reading of 15. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm holding the thing in the air. What are you getting a reading of 15 on? And then they caved, well, I was a cashier at Whole Foods up until 6 weeks ago, and somebody, told me how to do this. So long story short, I went to the CEO of the hospital and I said, listen, this doesn't work. I got to build my own program. So we did. Quality was way better. And then we started partnering with surgeons to do that so they could all have better quality intraoperative monitoring. Again, they changed in the Stark rule, shut that down. We had a year to dissolve it. This was across everybody. It's not like the OIG came after us. They just changed this, and our attorney said, hey, you guys have a year to dissolve all this stuff. So we had to buy the doctors out, and then we sold that to a private equity company. So all of these attempts to improve quality, decrease cost, and they're all shut down by these regulations. And now for me, all of a sudden, they're opening the pathway, and that's the big opportunity that I see. And I think that a lot of surgeons are beat up by this. They're beat up by Stark. They're beat up by the OIG anti-kickback. They've heard it their entire careers. And I think that, one of Gabe's points, it's 3 years since this has come out, and, it's not really moving that fast. Nobody I talk to knows about it. None of the docs in the trenches know. And I think there's a reason for that, because there is a threat. Does present a threat to the hospital systems. Because if the surgeons, and I think it presents a threat to anybody buying up physician practices, because if the physicians can do this on their own, or they can participate with a company like Influence Healthcare and get a seat at the table, they're the third group. Right now it's the payers and the hospitals, and they're just beating up the doctors. They're buying them up. They're putting them under whatever plan they want to put them, and they're making all the money. Once again, not putting it in to where it should be. It should be with the doctors. It's as simple as the doctor and the patient having a discussion and then executing a plan. And the doctors get a tiny piece of the pie. So that's really why I think this is a huge opportunity. I think it's going to resonate with the specialists, because with the specialists it's easier. God bless everybody in the primary care space and tackling that problem. But you want to talk about a data problem and figuring out what's actually going to lead to better care. I mean, that's a tough issue. And the fact that they're making great progress is tremendous. And there's another panel you hear about later where, can you integrate the primary into the specialist to really get the bang for your buck? And I think that's the holy grail. And we're trying to set up on the specialist side. I don't try to pretend to understand the primary side, but I want doctors to remain autonomous. I want them to get their fair share of the pie, and I want to get rid of a lot of this fraud and administrative nonsense that's in the healthcare space, and that's what we're aiming at.
So, Dr. Thraman, is Influence Health potentially a value-based enterprise?
That's all it is. I mean, we would not exist if it wasn't for these rule changes. I mean, this is the last big effort that I'm going out there as an entrepreneur. You're starting to get some gray hairs. Maybe all of them are gray. But, this is, I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I love it, and I can't turn it off. And this opportunity is too big, and there's too much good that can be done here for me to pass it up. So I'm going to lead the charge with the specialist side. And I know there's others out there that are looking at that opportunity as well. One of the sponsors of this program, the guys at Enlace, are going after that space, and I think will be very helpful to us in moving that forward. It's interesting that one of the guys one of the venture groups that funded my U.S. radiosurgery company was also one of the groups that funded Enlace. So there's a lot of consistency of the same folks looking at the problem, trying to solve it years later.
You brought up that example of neuromonitoring in the surgical suite, and that's still an issue, and it's still a quality issue. And I noticed that the Inspector General did an advisory opinion on a neuromonitoring arrangement that had surgeon investors, and they wouldn't bless it, because they were squarely dealing with the kickback statute in its traditional sense. Whereas I think if that entity was a value-based enterprise, it would be a different analysis. So.
Oh yeah, no doubt. I mean, you need the surgeon oversight, but here's my take on neuromonitoring, just from a 40,000 foot level. AI is going to take care of that problem. You can do 1,000 cases for nothing, with that. So I think that's where that's going. And there's going to be AI is going to have a lot of implications on the impact of value-based care, but nothing happens unless the doctors have a reason to pay attention to it, right? So that's what these tools are doing. That's where the strategy all comes together. It's being able to get the doctors to pay attention.
We have about 9 or 10 minutes. Any questions out there at this point? From the peanut gallery? Ed, I had a question. You were talking about coordinated care, sort of a first step platform in building a value-based arrangement. And you made mention that, in a coordinated care model, you can pay for referrals in certain aspects. How does that work exactly? And why wouldn't that be considered prohibited?
Well, under the Stark rules, they allow at least that can be an activity in furtherance of care coordination. And they give an example in the preamble where, I mean, this is CMS, articulating this example where a hospital decided if you used the physician's ordered a dual modality test rather than a single modality, that it could lead to better outcomes, catching things sooner, and more efficiencies over time. And they were proposing that it would take 2 years of information and practice patterns changing. And the proposal of the hospital was creating a value-based enterprise and paying them, I forget, it was $10 or something, every time they ordered the dual modality test rather than the single modality test. So they could then, that was their innovation, thinking if we create this process or protocol, it'll lead to better outcomes, and so that is permissible under Stark today. The one comment,
how do you validate that it's leading to those objectives, that it's furthering those purposes, which I think is sort of the key to.
It's got to be part of a care coordination protocol that's aiming at an objective, and you've got to be able to measure and record outcomes that demonstrate you're accomplishing progress. And there's no specific progress, but you're accomplishing progress towards that objective. And so,
Gabe, don't they have to, at the end of the year, you have to prove that you've created some progress in order to be able to continue doing it?
Under care coordination, you have to at least annually come back and evaluate your protocols and measure whether you're making progress. And if you're going to stay within these protections, you have to be able to document that progress, or you have a certain amount of time to eliminate that protocol. For instance, if there was no evidence that this two-modality diagnostic test was improving the outcomes and quality, then you would do away with that. Or if you had, the other part is you could modify the protocol. So you've got an obligation, if you're going to stay within these protections, to be monitoring and modifying and showing and documenting your progress. And when we get into the panel on operationalizing a value-based enterprise, that's an important piece of this monitoring and documentation and recording your actions you're taking, at least annually towards that goal.
So I remember when you and I were at one of our hospital general counsel forums down here, and either you or somebody was talking about value-based arrangements, and one of the GCs of one of the large hospital systems down here kind of referred to it, well, why isn't this just another fad that has come and gone? Now, I remember hearing that and thinking, I don't really think this is a come and gone fad, but are we seeing hospitals move into this space?
I think health systems are moving slower than, say, entrepreneurs like Jeff. I think, and we've had a conversation. We had a panelist with us in the last time we did this conference. Mike and I did this in Miami in June with another organization, and we had a hospital representative, and they know and are aware they need to be doing this, but there's so much fee for service. Money drives out, behaviors, and as long as fee for service is there, the sentiment is, we've even had GCs tell us from other, the event you and I went to about a year ago, a table of GCs, that they know they got to be changing, but they want to live off fee for service as long as they can. I think the takeaway point is they're going to live off fee for service as long as they can, and what we encourage them is you really need to be doing this on a parallel track. You need to be honing these skills and sharpening your tools, because if you don't, you're going to ultimately get left behind as this transition ultimately occurs.
Will it ultimately occur?
Well, if you believe Juliet, it will. So, I think it. I think like the ACO REACH program, the outcome on that. Mike and I represent a couple of ACO REACHs, and we had one we had to help rehabilitate some compliance issues, and then they had the transition. It was a direct contracting entity, And the outcomes are tremendous. I mean, those things make money if they know what they're doing. And that's why this whole concept of a value-based enterprise, you're contracting with the payers and you're contracting downstream. If you get good at doing that, people are making money, and ACO REACH is doing that. And so I think the answer is money's going to drive everything. And when people show the success stories, that's going to drive the transformation change. And Medicare has some success stories now, at least.
Well, it's clear that the federal government is doing everything that it can think of to drive this, because it's in their interest.
And Gabe, I just came back from Hawaii, and when I was in Hawaii, one day I was on one of the outer islands. They dropped us off and said, "We'll come back and get you in about 3.5 hours." And it's a little town about 6 blocks. What am I going to do for 3.5 hours? So I had lunch, and then walking down the island, I came across something called the Tsunami Museum. I didn't even know there was a tsunami, but I like museums. So I said to my wife, let's go look at the Tsunami Museum. And started thinking about tsunamis. And, and the whole idea of the whole concept of a tsunami is you got some earthquake, and then as a result of the earthquake, it creates a wave, and slowly but surely and inexorably, bam, and anything it hits. And so I'm thinking to myself, eventually, I think this will be like a tsunami, a minor tsunami, but a tsunami.
I just want to make one comment. I know we're out of time, but I previously said you can't fix the healthcare system, and we don't try with Influence Healthcare. But what you can do is you can build a new healthcare system where it's better for the doctors and it's easier to operate and they can make more money. So that's really what we're trying to do. So you do have fee-for-service sitting here and it's stuck, but you give them a value-based care option that's better, where they have autonomy, they don't have as much administrative nonsense, they can make the decisions that they want and they make more money, they're going to move over there. And their fee-for-service will always linger. You're going to have it, and it's going to be sitting there until it's not, right? You reach that tsunami point, and it crosses over. So that's why I think the doctors are really the key to the whole thing.
All right. That's a wrap for us. Thank you, Mike, Ed, Dr. Thraman. And I think we're going to move into operationalizing panel, right?
That's
okay.
right.
Thank you.